Bashar al-Assad's life and political journey. The rise of Bashar al-Assad, from a quiet childhood to an unexpected heir. Bashar al-Assad was born on September 11, 1965, in Damascus, Syria, as the second son of Hafiz al-Assad and Anisa Makhlouf. His family, belonging to the Alawite sect, had risen from modest beginnings to dominate Syrian politics. Hafiz al-Assad, a former Air Force officer, had seized power in 1971, establishing a rigid authoritarian regime that would shape Bashar's destiny. In contrast to his father's iron-fisted rule and his elder brother Basil's charismatic public persona, Bashar was a quiet and introverted child. His interests lay far from politics. He pursued medicine, earning a degree from Damascus University in 1988. Bashar's unassuming nature led many to believe that he would live out his life as a doctor, a path that seemed far removed from the ruthless world of Syrian politics. However, tragedy struck in 1994 when Basil, the heir apparent, died in a car accident. This unexpected event thrust Bashar into the spotlight as his father's successor. Reluctantly, Bashar abandoned his career as an ophthalmologist and returned to Syria. His father began grooming him for leadership, ensuring he gained experience in military and political affairs. Bashar enrolled in the Homs Military Academy, rising quickly through the ranks while simultaneously building his public image as a reformer. He assumed control of Syria's presence in Lebanon in 1998, sidelining rivals and consolidating his power. When Hafiz al-Assad passed away in 2000, the Syrian constitution was hastily amended to lower the presidential age requirement, enabling the 34-year-old Bashar to assume office. In a heavily controlled referendum, he was confirmed as Syria's new president. Despite initial hopes that Bashar might liberalize Syria's stagnant political system, his regime soon revealed its continuity with his father's oppressive legacy. The early years of his presidency saw brief moments of reform during what came to be known as the Damascus Spring. Intellectuals and activists cautiously advocated for political freedoms and transparency. However, the movement was quickly crushed as Bashar reasserted authoritarian control. Political dissent was met with crackdowns, censorship intensified, and the state of emergency, in place since 1963, remained firmly intact. Bashar's economic policies further alienated large swaths of the population. His push for economic liberalization benefited a small circle of loyalists, exacerbating inequalities and fostering resentment among the rural and working-class populations. Meanwhile, his regime exploited sectarian divisions to maintain its grip on power, further entrenching itself as a police state. By the mid-2000s, Bashar's presidency was marked by growing discontent at home and international isolation. Accusations of corruption and human rights abuses mounted, and his involvement in Lebanon's politics, particularly the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in 2005, led to widespread condemnation. These tensions set the stage for the dramatic events that would soon engulf Syria. The descent into chaos, from revolution to civil war. As the winds of the Arab Spring swept across the Middle East in early 2011, calls for change echoed within Syria. What began as small protests demanding political reform and the lifting of the decades-long state of emergency soon escalated into nationwide demonstrations. Bashar al-Assad's regime responded with brute force, employing security forces to crush dissent. The regime's violent crackdown only fueled the unrest, turning peaceful protests into a full-blown revolution. Assad's government portrayed the uprising as a foreign conspiracy, dismissing the demands of the protesters as the work of terrorists and germs. In a televised address, he mocked the Arab Spring as a destabilizing force, a rhetoric that revealed his intent to resist change at any cost. International condemnation followed swiftly, with Western nations imposing sanctions on the Syrian regime. However, Assad remained defiant, insisting that his rule was vital for Syria's stability. The situation spiraled further when Assad's forces began targeting civilian populations in cities like Homs and Aleppo, leading to widespread destruction and loss of life. By mid-2011, what had started as a revolution for political reform morphed into a brutal civil war. Various rebel factions emerged, including secular groups and Islamist militias. vying to overthrow the Assad regime. The conflict fractured Syria along sectarian and regional lines, plunging the nation into chaos. The Syrian civil war became a theater for international intervention, with global powers taking sides. Russia and Iran backed Assad, providing military and financial support that bolstered his forces. On the other hand, Western nations and Gulf states supported various rebel groups. The Assad regime's use of chemical weapons, most notably in the Ghouta attack of 2013,
حالة خوف يعني مو طبيعية، يعني ما شفناها بحياتنا وما عاد نشوفها يعني. 23 شخص تقريبا 11 كبار والباقي كله أطفال. 21/8 بال 2013 كنا قاعدين ببيتنا يعني عادي منطقتنا، وحوالي الساعة 2:30 بالليل حسينا على ضرب، صوت ضرب انفجار قوي يعني كبير.
Drew international outrage. While Assad denied responsibility, evidence implicated his government, prompting limited military responses from the United States and its allies. Despite facing significant losses on the battlefield, Assad's grip on power persisted, thanks largely to the unwavering support of Russia. In 2015, Russia launched a direct military intervention in Syria, turning the tide of the war. Russian airstrikes targeted rebel-held areas, enabling Assad's forces to reclaim key territories. This intervention not only solidified Assad's position, but also signaled Russia's intent to reassert itself as a major player in the Middle East. Despite the mounting challenges, Assad projected an image of strength, framing himself as the defender of Syria against terrorism. However, his regime's reliance on violence and repression only deepened the country's divisions, ensuring that peace would remain elusive. The fall of Bashar al-Assad, a tale of collapse and exile. The final chapter of Bashar al-Assad's reign began like the slow unspooling of a tightly wound thread. By late 2024, the regime had become a shadow of its former self, clinging desperately to the capital, Damascus. While international powers debated diplomatic solutions, rebel forces saw their opportunity. A coalition of fighters, including the powerful Islamist faction Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, launched an audacious campaign to bring down Assad once and for all. From Aleppo, the rebels pressed onward, advancing southward with stunning speed. Hama and Idlib became their next conquests. The Syrian army, once feared for its might, crumbled under the weight of relentless assaults and dwindling morale. The regime's inability to protect its strongholds sent shockwaves through Assad's inner circle. Even the Alawite loyalists, who had long stood by the president, began to question whether the fight was still worth it. By December 2024, the rebels had reached the outskirts of Damascus. Panic gripped the capital. Streets that once bustled with life fell silent as civilians fled, fearing the oncoming siege. Government officials burned documents and fled in convoys, leaving behind a city poised to become a battlefield. Inside the presidential palace, Bashar al-Assad faced the inevitable. For decades, the Assad name had been synonymous with power in Syria, but now it was a liability. On December 7th, as the first wave of rebel fighters breached the city's defenses, Assad made a decision that shocked even his closest allies. He fled. Under the cover of night, the man who had ruled Syria with an iron fist boarded a plane to Moscow, abandoning his once loyal supporters to face the advancing rebels. Russian officials confirmed his arrival hours later, stating that Assad and his family had been granted asylum on humanitarian grounds. The fall of Damascus was swift and decisive. Within hours of Assad's departure, rebel forces flooded the city. They tore down portraits of the president that had once adorned every public square, symbolizing the end of a 54-year dynasty. Celebrations erupted in some quarters, while others mourned the uncertainty that lay ahead. The capital, a city that had witnessed the heights of the Assad family's power, now stood as a testament to its dramatic fall. But the story doesn't end with Assad's flight. As he settled into a life of exile in Moscow, questions about his future began to swirl. Would he face international prosecution for war crimes? Could he ever return to Syria? Meanwhile, the nation he left behind grappled with a shattered economy, deep sectarian divisions, and a massive humanitarian crisis. The rebels, though victorious, were far from united. Tensions among factions hinted that peace might be an elusive goal. In exile, Assad lived a life far removed from the chaos of Syria. Reports described him as reclusive, residing in a heavily guarded compound on the outskirts of Moscow. He rarely appeared in public, his once defiant speeches replaced by silence. Some saw his asylum as a betrayal of the loyalists who had fought for him until the bitter end, while others viewed it as a calculated move to avoid capture. For the people of Syria, the fall of the Assad regime marked the end of an era, but not the end of their struggles. Rebuilding the nation would require more than removing a dictator. It demanded healing the wounds left by years of conflict. Could the rebels forge a new government capable of uniting the fractured nation? Or would Syria remain a patchwork of competing factions, torn apart by the very forces that had ousted Assad? The story of Bashar al-Assad's rise and fall is a poignant reminder of the impermanence of power. From a quiet, unassuming doctor to the ruler of a nation, and finally a fugitive in exile, his journey encapsulates the volatile nature of leadership in times of upheaval. Syria's next chapter remains unwritten, its future hanging in the balance as its people strive to rebuild a nation torn apart by war.
أما بعد، إخواني الكرام، نعيش في اللحظات الأخيرة لتحرير مدينة حمص بإذن الله تعالى. هذا حدث تاريخي الذي سيفصل بين الحق والباطل، ونوصي إخواننا المجاهدين كما أوصيناهم في السابق بأن يعطفوا على الناس، ومن ترك سلاحه فيؤمنوه، ومن فر فلا يدركوه، والحمد لله رب العالمين.